Hello and welcome to a special edition of Asian Voices. I'm your host, Kathleen Choi. On today's episode, with the help of the C2C Foundation, we share the incredible story of how 3 Vietnamese Americans who were all adopted as children from the same orphanage during the Vietnam War crossed paths in life 48 years later. Together, they established a nonprofit foundation with the mission to reconnect other Vietnamese adoptees with their surviving families. We share their stories of courage, hope, and redemption. That and more coming up next on Asian Voices. Meet the founder of C2C Foundation, Kirk Kellerhals. He was born in the city of Danang during the height of the Vietnam War. Adopted as a child by a family in the US, with the belief that his birth parents had been killed in the war. After 48 years, Kirk discovered the truth about their fate. Through his foundation, Kirk seeks to help reunite other war orphans with their birth families, and in helping them heal from a lifetime of emotional stigmas attached to being part of that tumultuous time in history.
I was born in Vietnam during the height of the Vietnam War in 1969. And soon after I was born, I ended up in an orphanage in Danang, the Sacred Heart Orphanage. I was adopted when I was about 2.5 years old by an Army major that was serving in Vietnam at the time. Moved to the United States, but as an Army brat, I lived all over the place, all over the United States, and spent a lot of time over in the Far East in different areas over there. I never actively looked for my parents, my birth parents, because I was under the assumption my entire life that they were killed in the war. You know, for all I knew, they were dead. So in 2017, when I finally did take a DNA test, it was simply to settle a bet between my wife and I, because there was this ongoing joke, kind of a bet between us, trying to figure out what my ethnicity was, because I knew half of me was Vietnamese, the other half was this big question mark. The funny thing is the only reason I took the DNA test was because there was a Groupon special for it. I know my wife had asked me to take it before, but I thought it was a waste of money. It was pretty expensive to me at the time, but then when I saw Groupon for half off, I figured why not? So I ended up taking the test, and then lo and behold, 30 days later, I got the shock of my life. I got an email from someone, and the subject line on the email simply said, "Looking for my son." And then the name on there was NGA. And I thought, okay, this is a scam. This is some rich Nigerian prince trying to, ask me to hold part of his inheritance for a small commission and yada, 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 Less than 5 minutes later, I got another email, and it was from the DNA company. And the DNA company subject line on that email said, parent-child match. It was just like a ton of bricks hit me. It was at that moment that I realized that name in the previous email was not African, but was indeed Vietnamese, and this was most likely my mom. So you can imagine what was going through my head, but I did find out after making the phone call that it was indeed my mother. And not only did I find out that my birth mother was alive and well, found out that she was alive and well, living in Texas, and had been living in the United States longer than I had been. And to top that off, I also found out in that same phone call that my birth father was still alive and well and living up in Syracuse, New York. So in the span of less than 60 seconds, my world was turned upside down. And on top of that, I had siblings on both sides of my birth mother and my birth father's side that I didn't know existed. And I was 47 years old at the time. So you can imagine going nearly 48 years of your life thinking your birth parents are dead, that you have nothing to show for your past, and then all of a sudden you just are completely overloaded with this new family. Right, it wasn't long after I had reconnected with my birth family and all these events happened that I realized what a blessing and what a gift it was. It was something that is rare, not only just to find a parent, but to find both parents, and on top of that, to find both parents that are open, willing, and accepting and wanting you to be a part of the family, and both birth parents who just happen to live in the United States and are alive and well. So I knew that was a huge blessing, because I've come across and met other adoptees that didn't have it so good. They're still looking for a family. They haven't found family, or even worse, they found family that didn't want anything to do with them. So I knew this was a huge gift and a huge blessing, and I knew there was something I needed to do with it. But for 2 years, I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I had no clue what it was I was supposed to do with this blessing, but I just knew that it was too big for me to keep to myself. I knew that I had to pay it forward. I knew that I had to do anything I could to help other adoptees like me who are, looking for identity, looking for family, looking for answers. I knew there was something I had to do to help them. And in the process of all this happening, I was able to have the opportunity to embark on a project, a documentary about what it's like to be an orphan, what it's like to be from Vietnam and to be a Vietnam orphan, and all the issues that adoptees and orphans from Vietnam deal with, and how reconnecting with families is such a challenge. During the process of researching for this documentary project I was on, I met another adoptee who was also at Sacred Heart Orphanage, which blew my mind, because the probabilities of meeting someone from the same orphanage during the same time frame, 8,000 miles away, nearly 50 years ago, to me was just astronomical. So I met this adoptee. Her name was Rachel Galvez, and another amazing thing was that she found her birth mother a month after I found mine. In talking with her and just comparing our stories, more importantly, we compared how it affected us. And what I discovered with Rachel was she had a very, very similar heart to mine as far as wanting to take these blessings and pay them forward, because we had both been blessed with very loving adoptive parents, grew up in very loving homes, had every opportunity in the world, and then some that any child growing up in the United States would be. And we both knew that there was so much more that we needed to do with this blessing. We thought, why not start a foundation? So we started this foundation. It's called the Coast to Coast Foundation. It stands for Southeast Asian Coast to Coast Foundation, or C2C for short, as we call it. But we embarked on this to not only help other adoptees, but we also have a very strong sense of gratitude for our servicemen and our servicewomen who serve in the military and do so much for us to be able to have the freedom to simply sit here like I am right now and be able to talk about my experiences with the Vietnam War. My name is Kirk Kellerhals, and this is my voice.
Welcome back. Also born in Danang in 1971 to a Vietnamese woman and American soldier, Canh Oxelson was immediately placed in the Sacred Heart Orphanage for the first 10 months of his life. In 1972, he was adopted by the Oxelson family, who raised him in a small farming community in Central California. Although Canh had spent most of his life searching for his true identity, it wasn't until recently that a DNA test revealed his biological mother was alive and still living near the orphanage he was adopted from.
So my story starts in 1971. I was born in November of 1971 in Danang, Vietnam. And from what I know, my father was an American serviceman and my mother was a woman who worked at a U.S. Army base there. The day after I was born, my birth mother decided to make sure that she got me to the Sacred Heart Orphanage. She realized she was not going to be able to keep me, and I, being half black and half Vietnamese, I could understand the thinking behind that maybe I would have better opportunities or even be safer at an orphanage with the potential for being adopted. Eventually, I was adopted by a family in the United States. The Oxelson family, at the time they lived in Minnesota, but as soon as I was adopted and came to the United States, they actually moved to California. So I actually grew up in Central California in a small farming community, right in the middle of California farmland. I don't remember my parents telling me I was adopted, but when you are half black and half Vietnamese and your mother and father are Swedish and Irish, it's pretty obvious something's up. So while I don't remember them sitting me down and having that conversation, it was obvious that I was adopted and I was very different. Those obvious differences made for a challenging childhood. Growing up, I was actually a competitive swimmer, and I had this dream that I wanted to be an Olympian. And I thought, if I made the Olympic team and represented the United States in the Olympics, NBC or whoever was broadcasting the Olympics would do one of those biographical, backgrounds. And I had this fantasy that my birth parents would actually see that and say, that's our son. and find me. And I never made it to the Olympics, but it was, I had a great time trying. It was great opportunities to travel and swim and compete. But once I graduated from college and I realized that I was probably not going to make the U.S. Olympic team, I started thinking a little bit more about my life, who I was at that point. And as I was retiring from swimming, I had to find almost a new identity. I had always thought of myself as an athlete, as an Olympic hopeful, and now I didn't have that anymore. That's when I started thinking a little bit more about Vietnam and what that meant to me. It's time for me to go back to Vietnam and see what I can find of my own history. I told my parents I was ready to go, and I remember my mom saying, you know, we saved money when you were a kid thinking that maybe you'd want to go back. We didn't want it to be a financial burden. I knew that this was a great opportunity to go, but I also knew that it was going to be really emotional, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it by myself. So I asked my family if they would go with me, and they did. So my adoptive parents, my adoptive sisters, I have 2 sisters, they came with me to Vietnam, and we actually found the orphanage where I had come from. We found Sacred Heart Orphanage in Danang and met the nuns who had taken care of me as a baby. Meeting the nuns who had taken care of me as a baby, walking the streets where I knew my birth mother had walked, just a phenomenal experience. I don't think I knew a lot about the conditions of Sacred Heart Orphanage before I had gone. I knew, I think, what I had heard from other adoptees that I had met along the way who had talked about returning to Sacred Heart. I knew stories that I'd read in the newspaper about veterans having visited different orphanages, but I don't know that I had a strong sense of what Sacred Heart was going to be like, what the conditions might have been. I did know that had I not been at Sacred Heart, I would have had a very difficult life, and there's a good chance that I might not have survived. It's hard to know how many orphans came out of the Vietnam War. I have seen the registry there at Sacred Heart, and I have a sense there were probably a couple thousand that came through Sacred Heart in Danang, but there are a lot more than that all over the world who came through different orphanages. I took my first DNA test back in 2011, and I was nervous about it. I had no idea what to expect. I didn't want my expectations to be too high, but I was very curious, and I was hoping to find some matches. It wasn't until 2020 that I actually found information about my birth mother's family. And maybe the year before I had found some information about my birth father's family. But I didn't actually connect with my birth mother's family until 2020. So it's relatively recent. I did discover that I have family in Chicago. They escaped Vietnam in the 80s and settled in Chicago, and so I was able to actually go and meet them. And I'm hopeful that I'll get a chance to meet my birth mother at some point. She does know that I'm alive, but I don't think she's ready to take that step where we would get a chance to meet. I'd always been a part of the Vietnamese adoptee community, at least for the last 20 years or so, but I remember being on Facebook and kind of just looking for more information, and I came across some Facebook postings about a project that Kirk Kellerhals was working on, and I remember thinking, wow, this is a young man who has had a very similar experience to me. He's adopted, he came through Sacred Heart, and he was working on this really cool project, and I wanted to help fund it. That project has since morphed into something else, the foundation that he and Rachel Galvez actually have founded, and I at some point decided I wanted to be a part of their efforts. I just loved what they were doing. I loved the gratitude that they expressed about the lives that they had been given, and that they were trying to do something with that gratitude and that experience, and I wanted to be a part of that. So one of the things that's come out of this work with the foundation is a docuseries that we're working on called Intersections, and it really is a chance for us to highlight some of the stories that are very interesting stories in and of themselves, but they're all connected. The docuseries, I think, is a great opportunity to highlight some really cool stories of people who have really overcome some very difficult and humble beginnings to do something with their lives, to kind of leave the world better than they found it. These are people who really have love in their hearts, gratitude in their hearts, and are really trying to do something good with that. And I hope the docuseries, I hope it inspires people. I'm Canh Oxelson, and this is my voice.
Welcome back. Our last story again begins in Danang, where Rachel Galvez and Mike Anderer were also given up for adoption at the Sacred Heart Orphanage. They grew up on the East Coast of the US and became very successful in their careers. However, both also felt the emptiness and longing of not knowing their Vietnamese roots. But all that changed thanks to the C2C Foundation, as we will find out.
The C2C Coast Foundation I co-founded with another adoptee who I had met through another project that we were working on. I had met over Zoom, and we coincidentally found our birth mothers the same year, in 2017. We had very similar stories. We grew up in our adoptive families, 5 kids. We grew up, in very nice families. I don't think either of us had ever expected to find biological relatives. So we weren't going into this taking the DNA test for that reason. Yet we both found our birth mothers, and he actually found his birth father the same year. The other co-founder, Kirk Kellerhals, and I had a similar vision of taking our stories and doing something positive with it. Again, I sort of had this idea since 2017. I wrote a small article for my local paper in 2018, but since then I hadn't really done anything, and I wasn't sure what I could do with it.
As a person, I've always identified myself as Amerasian, Vietnamese American. I definitely have a blood connection to Vietnam. It's part of my heritage, but I also grew up American. I grew up like a traditional, typical American boy. So I have, as they say, it's sometimes a foot in both worlds. I was introduced to the foundation through Kirk and Rachel. Kirk was working on another project. I saw that project mentioned on Facebook. I reached out to Kirk because I was very interested to hear his story. We spoke on the phone a few times, and then I had the opportunity to meet Kirk, Canh, and Rachel in New York City. They discussed the foundation with me and talked about the hopes and ambitions for the foundation.
Some of the missions that we've stated with the C2C Foundation does have a timestamp on it, because the war that we were adopted from ended in 1975. So the adoptees are getting older and the veterans are getting older. However, I see this being more of a long-term thing. It could help perhaps veterans of all wars.
So I started to get involved. I pledged my support, and then we had a few Zoom meetings to try to establish some roles and responsibilities. And in probably April or May of this year, I was elected board chairman for the foundation. And that's an honor that I hope to deliver some great work. The foundation means hope. It's about giving hope to those people who are struggling to find connections. There are people who are adopted who don't have any biological connection.
So I believe sharing my journey will help others by, one, having someone maybe or some part of my life that they can relate to. So maybe that'll give them some sense of comfort. I also hope to give people some hope. Again, my life and where I am now sort of emotionally is not where I've always been. So for me, it's been very therapeutic and cathartic to reconnect with other adoptees and learn more about my history. So for people that are wanting to do that, I think it'll be helpful.
It's also about giving hope to the veterans, Vietnam veterans, but also any veterans for the military and active U.S. military, to help them with the emotional struggles of being in conflict. It's something that is near and dear to my heart. My father is a veteran.
Additionally, one of the reasons I really wanted to establish this foundation was to have a legacy for my kids and maybe even my grandkids. So they, if they're interested, they could say, oh, this is my mom's history, this is part of my history, or this is my grandmother's history. So you have an actual entity that is, hopefully a long-standing entity. When I'm gone, which hopefully won't be anytime soon, I'd like to be remembered as a genuine, non-judgmental, caring person.
When I think about people saying that one person can't make a difference, I think of all the lives that I've touched already, and I'm excited to think about all the lives that I can touch in the future.
I'm Rachel Galvez.
I'm Mike Anderer,
and this is
my voice.
My voice.
This program was made possible in part by the California Arts Council, advancing California through the arts and creativity. Team Metro Real Estate, helping families with real estate investments in San Diego since 1990. Contact us today for your free in-home market valuation. Promote your organization or event online today on Asian Pacific Community Connection Business Directory website. Asian Voices was brought to you by Asian Culture and Media Alliance, empowering our Asian and Pacific Islander communities through media arts since 2013.
Please support the only television program
that creates a voice of real change.
Asian Voices.
Asian Voices.
Asian Voices.
Asian Voices.
Asian Voices.
Asian Voices.
This is our voice.
Well, that's all for today's show, but be sure to check out our YouTube channel and please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Now, I'll leave you with today's music video by an upcoming talented API music artist. I'm Kathleen Choi, and I'll see you next time on Asian Voices. Until then, take care, everyone.
Rock, night, punch, she'll play you all night long. She sings songs like a siren, lead you on. Shiny and smooth and appealing, dangerous and cunning and stunning. Silently, she'll leave you wanting more. She knows the secret, true winners never surrender. One bad move is all it takes for the queen to win the game. She is reckless, don't try hiding fear behind your smile. Life is not a game of chess, you can't plan where you'll go next. Even if you draw the map, you'll end up in her head. Hold up, it's the Queen's Play, Queen's Play. Hold up, love is her game, her game. Obviously, she's the best piece across the board. Royalty, not a girl you can afford. Even if her world's on fire, she knows that she can acquire. In the end, everything her heart desires. She knows the secret, true winners never surrender. One bad move is all it takes for the queen to win the game. She is reckless, don't try hiding fear behind your